Hello, learners, and welcome to another lecture in this NPTEL course on Victorian literature. In the previous lecture, I introduced Edward Said's very important work on the importance of imperialism for reading and understanding the literary culture of 19th century England, and I introduced the concept of contrapuntal reading. We will understand contrapuntal reading further by looking at more instances of Victorian novels which can be studied with this proper accounting of the history of imperialism. And we will also read from another instance of manifest Orientalism in the example of Thomas Macaulay's document, The Minute on Indian Education, in this lecture. So, in the previous lecture, I spent some time describing how Jane Austen's classic novel, Mansfield Park, can be enriched by a contrapuntal reading, and this is also reading that Edward Said provides in his book, Culture and Imperialism. I will spend some time now on another very well-known and very beloved novel of Victorian literature, a novel, in fact, that we will be discussing in this course later, that is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Just like many Victorian novels that I named in the previous lecture, which have references to locations outside England, just as Mansfield Park names Antigua, Great Expectations names Australia, and Vanity Fair names India, Jane Eyre also very powerfully signals the interconnected and global status of England in the Victorian era by naming many places outside England whose exploitation was central to the well-being from which Victorian literature, indeed novels like Jane Eyre, emerged. Two of these places are Jamaica and India. There are many characters who refer to Jamaica and India. The most obvious connection to Jamaica is the character Bertha Mason. Bertha Mason is presented as a mad woman in the attic, a phrase that's used by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar. And this character is important because her psychological suffering, in a way, foreshadows and becomes a foil and foundation on which the human development of Jane as the protagonist is founded. Right? This is a reading that was given most powerfully by the scholar Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak in the essay titled Three Women's Texts and a Critique of Imperialism. In this text, Gayatri Spivak provides a critical analysis of three novels, that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and White Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. It's important to note that Jean Rhys's White Sargasso Sea is a retelling of Jane Eyre. And the connections to India and Jamaica, which are somewhat muted, somewhat diffused, and whose significance is not spelt out in a great deal of critical detail or force, are heightened, and these references are developed and spelt out by later writers and scholars. So, what are these references? Let's spend some time thinking about them. Bertha Mason is a person who has gone mad by the time we meet her in Jane Eyre. Bertha Mason is a Jamaican woman who Rochester has married, not out of love or any human relation, but simply because he wanted to own some property in the Caribbean. Rochester, like Lord Bertram, who was named earlier, the character in Mansfield Park, Rochester in Jane Eyre also comes from a line of white British men who have financial interests, who have proprietary interests in the Caribbean, who have been enabled by the force of the British Navy, by the violence that the British Navy and the British armed forces have inflicted. They have gone in and colonized spaces in the Caribbean. Now, in order to ensure that some kind of property stays within his family, Rochester has entered into a sort of alliance in which he agreed to marry the daughter of some kind of a financial leader. So, this marriage of Rochester and Bertha was conducted simply as a way to grab and exploit some property in the Caribbean. And because of this relationship, because there is no human dignity involved in this relationship, and because Bertha Mason is a black woman, Rochester feels emboldened enough and feels that he has the right to imprison this woman in the attic of the house, property which, ironically, he has inherited through his marriage with her. So, this is the situation that we see in the novel Jane Eyre. And at a key moment, we see Jane barely escapes a harrowing experience in which the house is burnt down by this woman. Everyone escapes the burning house except Bertha, who dies in the house. Now, this instance, this description of Bertha Mason's existence in England, the madness that she undergoes, the suffering that she undergoes, and which everyone fails to understand and even recognize, and ultimately her violent death which very conveniently spares everyone except herself, has long been recognized by scholars of Victorian literature. All of this has been recognized as Charlotte Bronte's acknowledgement that there existed a global and violent history of imperialism, at the center of which England existed, and which could not be detached, which could not be removed from the cultural production, from the literary production of the Victorian novel. Alliances like those between Rochester and Bertha, which ultimately led to the death of Bertha and the financial stability and security of Rochester. Alliances like these were common and often not recorded. Jane Eyre as a novel is unique for recording that experience, even though it records it only from the perspective of its protagonist, who is a white female subject. This inequality is pointed out by Gayatri Spivak, who argues that this relationship between Victorian England and England's colonies is referenced in great works of Victorian literature, and it needs to be studied. Why do Victorian novels refer to these histories, even though it may undermine their own autonomy? So it may undermine the voice and the perspective of Charlotte Bronte if Bertha Mason's voice is given more importance, for instance. And in many readings of Jane Eyre, this is exactly what happens. Many scholars argue that by giving Jane's voice more importance than Bertha's, Charlotte Bronte has done a kind of disservice, that it's an act of irresponsibility. It is possible to make that claim, and indeed many scholars have made that claim. So this is an interesting and complex cultural development. It is not possible to say with much certainty where Charlotte Bronte can be placed or what position Charlotte Bronte must be attributed to in this debate of the moral correctness or the pragmatism of England's colonization of spaces outside England. Further, there are also references to India. There is a character, St. John Rivers, spelt as St. John Rivers, but pronounced St. John Rivers, who proposes marriage to Jane repeatedly at multiple points in the novel. This person is a missionary. He constantly travels to India with the aim of civilizing, reforming what he considers to be backward practices in India. And among the backward practices that St. John Rivers is trying to reform, change, improve, is the practice of sati, the practice which involved the burning alive of women on the funeral pyres of their dead husbands. Gayatri Spivak's claim is that there is a very strong relationship, causal relationship between the invocation of the suffering of the Indian woman, referred through this reference to India, and described in this narrative of a white woman's intellectual and spiritual and social development, which we see in Jane Eyre, right? And this development is hinted at in several English novels. Uh, Jane Eyre is perhaps the most memorable and powerful iteration of this intellectual development. Let us now read how Gayatri Spivak describes this complicity. Spivak writes, "It should not be possible to read 19th century British literature without remembering that imperialism, understood as England's social mission, was a crucial part of the cultural representation of England to the English. The role of literature in the production of cultural representation should not be ignored. These two obvious facts continue to be disregarded in the reading of 19th century British literature. This itself attests to the continuing success of the imperialist project, displaced and dispersed into more modern forms." The key thing to note in this opening sentence, there are several, but among them, the first thing to note is the tone with which Spivak begins. It should not be possible, right? It's hinting at a difficulty or an unease which must exist in the act of reading 19th century British literature. Why should we become uneasy? We should become uneasy because we must remember that what we are reading has had a very different social mission, and it was part of how England became self-conscious, or English people became self-conscious. How did they become self-conscious? They became conscious of who they were by referring to the backwardness of other people, as well as how this backwardness could be fixed or improved by the work of English subjects, right? This is one. The civilizing mission, right? The civilizing mission of England was central to the understanding of English identity. And English literature very often reinforced this self-consciousness and this backwardness of other people. The second thing to note is that it is possible to question this mode of becoming self-conscious, and it depends on how one reads English literature, right? One should always be aware that English literature performs this ideological role. It creates an image of England as civilized, and it reinforces that image by reminding readers of the backwardness or barbarism of people outside England. But it depends how one reads English literature. Now, moving on from Spivak to Edward Said's work, right? In the book Culture and Imperialism, Said refers not only to English literature but also certain racialist theories which accompanied the development of British imperialism in the early and mid-1800s. So, for instance, Said refers to the work of certain scholars, writers, and thinkers such as Thomas Carlyle, who I discussed in my second lecture, as many of you will recall, and Thomas Macaulay, whom I mentioned in my first lecture, and I will spend some time discussing in this lecture. In addition to these scholars, the art critic John Ruskin is also discussed in Said's book on imperialism. Said cites passages from these writers to support the view that imperialist policy was bound up with racial theories of superiority and inferiority. Said refers to Carlyle's occasional discourse on the nigger question. Said also refers to Ruskin's lectures at the University of Oxford, delivered in the year 1870, in which Ruskin refers to the British as a still undegenerate race, meaning that there were other degenerate races, and it was the duty of the British race to civilize these degenerate races. So this is an instance of what I had described as manifest Orientalism, as opposed to latent Orientalism. The literary texts, the novels and poems which I've been discussing, can be called instances of a latent Orientalism because even though they may assume a certain unsympathetic and unrealistic stereotypes about Oriental and Occidental identities, they do not make any overt statements about the superiority or inferiority of Occidental or Oriental peoples, respectively. However, these writers, that is, Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, Thomas Macaulay, these are writers who are not shy about declaring and being very, very explicit about these hierarchies, about these superiorities. And these are instances of what can be called manifest Orientalism. Edward Said asserts that British writers saw a tremendous international display of British power virtually unchecked over the entire world. Said notes an impressive circularity of reasoning by which the British asserted their own superiority to others because of their power and the inferiority of others because of their powerlessness. Right? So this becomes a circular argument because on one hand, the British government had suppressed a lot of native rebellions all over the world through the technological and military superiority of the British armed forces. Now, once military superiority was established, Said argues a lot of Victorian writers began to declare cultural superiority as well. Right? Now, this is circular because there is no relation between the two. And in fact, cultural superiority cannot emerge if material or technical superiority does not exist. So, to declare cultural superiority, having established military superiority, is a bit circular and tautological in Said's critical understanding of imperialism. Said also includes a chart that documents British foreign aggression throughout the world from 1839 to 1882. This chronological summary begins with the Opium Wars in China, continues with the Crimean War, and the suppression of the Indian Mutiny. This chart ends with the destruction of the Maori resistance in New Zealand and the conquest of Egypt. So you can see that ways of thinking, right, assumptions about the superiority of the British race or the Caucasian or the white race, and assumptions about the inferiority or the barbarism or the lack of civilization or incompetence of other non-white, non-Caucasian races was not simply an idea that was held by writers and scholars, or it was not simply a debate that unfolded in the British Parliament, but it actually informed policies, diplomatic strategies, and actually wars of conquest. Right? A lot of rebellions by native and indigenous people were suppressed, and military force was deployed to enforce these ideas and to realize these ideas of superiority, as mentioned in all these different parts of the world, whether it was Egypt, New Zealand, India, or even closer home in Crimea. So we have reached a point where we understand how different scholars as well as writers think about legacy and try and articulate a material and factual understanding of the legacy of Victorian England. What is the legacy of Victorian England? How do we make sense of the developments that unfolded in this era? And how exactly can one respond to the legacy of violence? Right? One instance of a very overt and manifest Orientalism is a document that was first written and argued in the year 1835. This is the document titled Minute on Indian Education. The author of this is Thomas Macaulay. I will spend a few minutes now on this document and try and understand how this document can tell us a great deal both about colonial discourse and post-colonial critique. This document is essentially an intervention in a debate The debate in the British Parliament was what should be the best way to spend a sum of money. The amount was 1 lakh rupees, and you can imagine that in the year 1835, that amount, adjusting for inflation, would mean a stupendous amount of money. It was a great deal of, it was a great lump sum of money. And given the amount of money, it was an important debate about how it should be best used in order to educate the natives of India. Right? India was a British colony, and the question was how to use this money to educate the natives. One view held that this money should be used to support education in vernacular Indian, that is Arabic, Sanskrit, and other South Asian languages. Another view held that this money should be used to educate the natives in English and other European languages. Macaulay's point was that this money should be used to educate the natives in English. And the justification for this was of two kinds. There were factual reasons, there were practical or material reasons that Macaulay provided for this decision. And there were also certain ideological or emotional reasons which Macaulay provided to support his claim that this money should be used to impart education in English. Now, it is the ideological or the emotional claims that have attracted the attention of a great deal of post-colonial scholars and have made Thomas Macaulay quite notorious in the history of Victorian England. We will try and understand where that notoriety comes from. But first, let's understand who Macaulay was responding to. Now, Macaulay will use the word Orientalists repeatedly in this speech. Now, the word Orientalists in this 19th century discourse means something very different from the word Orientalist, which is used in Edward Said's book, which is published in the late 20th century. Now, the Orientalist that Macaulay refers to, people like William Jones, a scholar of Sanskrit and many other languages and disciplines, who translated Kalidas, one of the earliest English translations of Kalidas, into English. The text was Abhigyan Shakuntalam, and William Jones is supposed to have made the claim that Kalidas was the Shakespeare of India. Macaulay's argument is against the Orientalists of this kind. Orientalists believed that there was a great deal of value, a great deal of intellectual, linguistic, philosophical, cultural knowledge to be had from this literature of India. That is, the great tradition of writing in Sanskrit, Arabic, and other Indian languages. Therefore, in order to retrieve that literature, the British government was called on to spend some of its quite considerable resources. These were the Orientalists. That was the argument they made. Macaulay comes down against this position, and let us try and understand exactly what Macaulay says. He begins by saying, "We now come to the gist of the matter. We have a fund to be employed as government shall direct for the intellectual improvement of the people of this country. The simple question is, what is the most useful way of employing it?" He argues further, and I read, "All parties seem to be agreed on one point, that the dialects commonly spoken among the natives of this part of India contain neither literary nor scientific information, and are moreover so poor and rude that until they are enriched from some other quarter, it will not be easy to translate any valuable work into them. It seems to be admitted on all sides that the intellectual improvement of those classes of the people who have the means of pursuing higher studies can at present be effected only by means of some language not vernacular amongst them." Now, in this passage, we can see that the emphasis comes not so much on the intrinsic quality or merit of Indian languages, but rather on the lack of availability of Western discourses in these languages, right? So the problem seems to be that the kind of education that the British government needs to provide to the natives of India is not already available or is not originally composed in these vernacular Indian languages. Therefore, if the Indians are to be taught the methods of governance, the laws of Victorian England or the Constitution of England or anything like that, then the study material, the textbooks, would have to be created from scratch. Right? This is the argument, and not so much about the quality or the value of Indian literature. Further, Macaulay states that even though he has no knowledge of Sanskrit or Arabic, he has done some homework in terms of reading translations. He further states that, and I quote, "I have never found one among them, that is, those who are experts in these languages and literatures, who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. The intrinsic superiority of the Western literature is indeed fully admitted by those members of the committee who support the Oriental plan of education." Right? So this part, these two sentences have been quoted widely and are single-handedly responsible, or dual-handedly, given that there are two sentences, that they are responsible for creating a very notorious reputation for Macaulay in the history and theory of post-colonial literature. Why is that? The first sentence, we can obviously see why it would create a bad impression. It is making a hierarchical, value-laden judgment. It is saying that the literature of one part of the world is better and that the literature of another part of the world is worse. Right? Further, it is also making a dramatic and exaggerated statement about the quality. The second statement cuts a little bit closer to the bone of those Orientalists who I just named, writers like William Jones, who translated Abhigyan Shakuntalam. Here, Macaulay seems to be exposing, seems to be doing the work of post-colonial theory a little bit by saying that even those who claim to admire Indian literature, right, even those who claim to admire the qualities of Oriental writing, actually, if you come down to it, or if one were to really examine the underlying assumptions of such translation and scholarship, one would understand that even these advocates of Indian literature do not really admire Indian literature and finally admit in the last instance that Western literature is actually intrinsically superior to Indian literature. So these are some instances of manifest Orientalism and some statements which give Macaulay a very bad name in the history and theory of post-colonial writing. We will continue our discussion of Macaulay, and we will read the work and understand the work of one poet who might be a beneficiary of this very, very colonial discourse and which might surprise and complicate the script of this Orientalist policy. We will discuss that in the next lecture. Thank you.